Charles Stratton, a.k.a. Tom Thumb, and his wife Lavinia performed in the circus with their babies, but they were also hiding under range secret. Charles Stratton didn't inherit his sight from his mother or father. Both of his parents were of average stature. They were, however, first cousins. His father, Sherwood Edward Stratton, was a carpenter, while his mother, Cynthia Thompson, was a cleaner. The humble couple was no stranger to life's curveballs, but after they welcomed their son, they experienced their biggest surprise yet. When Charles was born on January 4, 1838, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was even considered a large baby, but by his first birthday, the Strattons realized something was seriously wrong. Charles hadn't grown in 6 months. At this point, he was only 25 inches tall and weighed 15 pounds. They raised him to the doctor, fearing the worst. The doctor confirmed their fears. It was unlikely that Charles would ever reach adult height, but luckily there was a silver lining. His body was proportionate and healthy, and size aside, he was a normal child. Still, his parents couldn't help but worry. After all, how would their little boy be able to thrive in a world that was too big for him? Luckily, word of Charles reached a legend's ears, and his life would never be the same again. When Phineas T. Barnum heard about a tiny child in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the greatest showman knew he had to meet this kid. After tracking Charles down, Phineas knew he'd hit the jackpot. He begged the Strattons for the permission to exhibit their 4-year-old son in New York City, alongside adults with unusual features. When his parents agreed, the businessman was ecstatic and determined to turn this little boy into a huge star, no matter what. Most 4-year-olds are just learning how to read and write, but our Charles was no ordinary kid. Instead of going to a normal school, he learned everything he'd need to be a star. This included singing, dancing, miming, and even impersonating famous people. Now, with the tools of the trade under his belt, Charles needed a shiny, marketable identity, and Phineas had a perfect idea. Charles Stratton is a perfectly fine name, but it was missing that star quality, at least according to Phineas. But the showman came up with the stage name General Tom Thumb. He borrowed from English folklore. Tom Thumb was a character who was the size of his father's thumb and got into all kinds of shenanigans. But Phineas still wasn't satisfied. A new name wasn't enough. The showman invented an identity for Charles. He was no longer Charles Stratton, a 4-year-old from Connecticut. To audiences, he was an 11-year-old from England. Even worse, Cynthia, Charles's mother, had no idea until it was too late. She was furious until the act became a head and money started rolling in. With General Tom Thumb wasn't just successful because of his backstory or size. Charles had something most of us can only dream of. It didn't take long for Charles to make a big impact. His earliest performances in New York and first national tour, all at only 5 years old, were turning points in freak show entertainment. Thanks to General Tom Thumb, it became one of the most popular types of entertainment. But this success came with a weird problem. Phineas and Charles' competitors saw their success and mountains of money, and they wanted a slice of this ever-growing pie. Their rivals came out with an imitation of General Tom Thumb. It got so bad that newspapers put up warnings about these wannabes. They say that imitation is the sincere's form of flattery, but Phineas and Charles probably didn't feel this way, since the copycats cut into their bottom line. But they had bigger goals than their imitators: global domination. A year later, Phineas and Charles went on a 3-year European tour with dreams of international fame and fortune. But it didn't take long for disappointment to set in. Things weren't looking great until Phineas had a genius realization. Class meant everything in England. They should have been focusing on charming the upper classes. Phineas changed tactics and aggressively networked with the upper class until he landed in an audience with Queen Victoria. While meeting Queen Victoria was a make-or-break moment, Charles went for his usual cheerful and comedic routine. Turns out, this was super risky, because the royals were still in mourning for Prince Albert's father. But against all odds, it worked. In general, Tom Thumb charmed Queen Victoria. He even pretended to defend himself against one of the Queen's yappy dogs. Thanks to her seal of approval, everything changed. Thanks to Queen Victoria and the European tour, General Tom Thumb became the most famous entertainer of his time in the United States and in Europe. Charles couldn't go anywhere without crowds mobbing him, and infamously, many in these crowds were adoring women who wanted a lot more than a glimpse of General Tom. Women waited in line just for a chance to kiss General Tom Thumb, who, as a reminder, is the child Charles Stratton. But it was par for the course for this child star who never had a childhood. To be sold off to the circus is a strange foundation for youth. Losing your childhood to it makes it so much worse. Phineas didn't just lie about Charles' age, he expected the boy to act much older than he actually was. Charles not only spent all his time with adults, but he started drinking at 5 and smoking at 7. All part of the trade-off for wealth beyond Stratton's wildest dreams. Charles wasn't in working-class Connecticut anymore, that's for sure. Thanks to Phineas' management and his own talents, he became extremely wealthy. While Charles had expensive taste, he had the wallet to back it up. Charles owned luxury real estate, the Phineas clothes, and even a yacht. But most importantly, his wealth played no small role in attracting the love of his life. Enter Lavinia Mercy. Lavinia Bump was a fellow little person, but her life couldn't have been more different than Charles. She had a normal childhood and became a well-respected schoolteacher. In adulthood, Lavinia chose to turn her normal life upside down after learning about General Tom Thumb. Inspired by her success, she took a risk leaving her stable life and entered the crazy world of entertainment. Phineas ended up managing Lavinia, and now it was only a matter of time before she crossed paths with Charles. According to Phineas, it was love at first sight, at least for Charles. He allegedly said, "Mr. Barnum, that is the most charming little lady I ever saw, and I believe she was created on purpose to be my wife. Now, you have always been a friend of mine, and I want you to say a good word for me to her. I have got plenty of money, and I want to marry and settle down in life, and I really feel as if I must marry that young lady." Charles was now a man on a mission, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in his way. Hoping to impress her, Charles showed Lavinia around his mansion and lavish life. But he didn't stop there. They went around town and toured as many investment properties. "It worked," he told Phineas. "It seems as if you and Tom Thumb owned about all of Bridgeport, but Charles had a rival in the battle for her hand in marriage. George Washington Morris in Nut, or Commodore Nutt, had a lot in common with Charles. They were both little people, entertainers, and part of Phineas's company. And they were both in love with the same woman, Lavinia. Lavinia, however, was older than Charles, and never saw him as anything more than a nice little boy. Unfortunately, Phineas accidentally made their love triangle even more complicated. Phineas gifted Lavinia a diamond and emerald ring, but it didn't fit. The showman suggested she gift the ring to George. It was supposed to be a token of her friendship. Instead, George viewed it as a token and declaration of her love. Charles wanted Phineas to support him instead of George, and knew exactly how to make this happen. Charles promised if the showman helped him marry Lavinia, he'd have a public wedding. Basically, he promised to make Phineas even richer. With the dollar signs in his eyes, the showman convinced Lavinia to consider Charles. Unsurprisingly, George didn't exactly take this portrayal lightly. The love triangle between Lavinia, Charles, and George reached its climax in one of the most dramatic ways. According to Phineas, George and Charles didn't just disagree over who had the right to court Lavinia. Their rivalry escalated into a physical fight at work over her. The showman claims George started it by throwing Charles onto the floor, but that was only the beginning. When George arrived at Phineas's house one night, his heart sank. Charles and Lavinia were spending time alone in a parlor. Charles had proposed, and Lavinia had said yes. George felt as though Phineas and Charles betrayed him in the worst way. He struggled to forgive them for their dastardly offenses. Regardless of how George felt, the show and wedding must go on. The dramatics didn't stop there. In fact, a blackmailer disrupted their wedding planning. A woman threatened to publish unflattering things about Charles and Lavinia. However, nobody batted an eye. Phineas even dared her. "You may print 100,000 copies." To the showman, there was no such thing as bad publicity. In 1863, Charles married Lavinia in New York City. The wedding was many things, but intimate it was not. The newlyweds even stood on top of a grand piano to greet their 10,000 guests. The maid of honor was Minnie Warren, Lavinia's sister and fellow little person, which was to be expected. Charles' best man was George, certainly less so. Charles had promised to make Phineas a fortune from his wedding. They even sold tickets to the reception for $75, roughly $1,800 today, and yet it still sold out. Charles and Lavinia reached even greater heights of fame and fortune after marrying, if that's even possible. Their American fans couldn't help but be enthralled by the newlyweds, especially to distract themselves from the horrors of their own nation. 1863 wasn't just the year Charles and Lavinia married. It was also right in the middle of the Civil War. Amazingly, their wedding knocked the conflict off the New York Times front page for 3 whole days. After all, the wedding and their story provided much-needed escapism for a conflict-wearied nation. But Charles and Lavinia couldn't charm everyone. Most Americans viewed Charles and Lavinia's wedding and story as a fairy tale, but others were not so convinced. Some cynics believed that this was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Charles responded furiously. He responded, "We are simply man and woman of like passions and infirmities, with you and other mortals. The arrangements for our marriages are controlled by no showmen, for the offensiveness of these cynics paled in comparison to the nosy Nellies." During the pair's grand tours, even President Lincoln held a reception for them at the White House. It was an interesting scene. The newlyweds were famously short, while Lincoln was famously tall. But the legendary politician made them feel more than welcome. When someone rudely asked Charles, "They call you General, do they?" the president interjected, "I wish my generals were as good a general as he is." The two soon found out the hard way that there were 3 participants in his relationship. This time, it wasn't pesky George, it was his fame and the annoying fans that came with it. The newlyweds felt like an army of curiosity-mongers were always breathing down their necks. Fame was a double-edged sword, and they learned this the hard way over and over again. Charles and Lavinia were magnets for criminals who thought they would be easy victims, especially under many tours. On one memorable occasion, 2 robbers stalked them. Luckily, the authorities stopped them in the nick of time, but the newlyweds weren't always so lucky. Another time, they found a ton of money missing from their hotel room. Turns out, a maid had swiped it, but the girl was so distraught, the couple took mercy on her and didn't press charges. The wedding had lifted Charles and Lavinia's reputation to new heights, but they, including Phineas, wanted more. During their appearances, Charles and Lavinia started showing up with babies that everyone assumed were theirs. This addition to their story made the pair even more popular. Eventually, Phineas claimed that the child had passed, but this was all an elaborate ruse. Lavinia later confessed they rented babies from hospitals and orphanages. It seemed like yet another tall tale, or was it? It gets even weirder. Charles and Lavinia may have actually had a child after all. Years later, a historian discovered evidence suggesting that the child wasn't just a hoax, But why would Lavinia randomly confess to lying? Frustratingly, this may always remain an unsolved mystery. That said, starting a family wasn't Charles and Lavinia's only problem. Phineas marketed Charles and Lavinia as childlike biggest sympathy sold tickets, but this came at a big cost. The two performers were adults, accomplished and brilliant, but people infantilized them and crossed boundaries. Fans even wanted to pet and hold Lavinia. She raged. It seemed impossible to make people understand at first that I was not a child, that being a woman I had the womanly instinct of shrinking from a form of familiarity, which, in case of a child of my size, would have been as natural as it was permissible. That was only the tip of the iceberg. In January 1883, Charles and Lavinia were fast asleep in the room at the Newhall house when a frantic and loud knocking woke Charles. He groggily opened the door to an officer who raced inside. In an instant, he was wide awake. He realized fire surrounded the room. Charles and Lavinia found themselves in the heat of the Newhall house fire, one of the worst hotel fires in American history. They realized with dawning horror that the only way out was the window. The officer frantically opened the window and screamed for a ladder. Wearing only his pajamas, Charles climbed his way down to safety. The officer holding Lavinia followed. They survived, but 71 unfortunate souls were not so lucky. Lavinia was beyond grateful that they survived, but realized Charles wasn't exactly on the same page. Surrounded by destruction and suffering, he complained about all the luxury items he lost. Shocked and disgusted, Lavinia scolded him. "So what if we have lost everything? Look at those people there." Lavinia then proved she literally was his better half by helping fellow survivors out. Charles may have survived the fire, but he wouldn't be so lucky next time. While the infantilizing marketing continued, Charles aged rapidly and badly. For example, his skin didn't just wrinkle, it yellowed. He gained a lot of weight and even a little height. A newspaper even wrote that Charles looked like an orange that had been sat upon. Most people would have called it quits at this point, but Charles couldn't bring himself to. Why wouldn't Charles retire after struggling with his health and securing his fame and fortune? You see, Charles was addicted to the limelight. He admitted, "I can't do without the excitement of public life." After all, his life, as crazy as it was the only one he'd ever known. Tragically, Charles would never experience the peace and serenity of retirement. On July 15, 1883, Charles woke up tired, but otherwise fine in his Middleborough mansion. It was supposed to be another normal day. He chatted with his brother-in-law, Edward. Immediately after Edward left, he heard a loud noise as if something heavy dropped on the floor. He ran back and found Charles lifeless on the floor. It was a stroke. This was barely 6 months after the Newhall house fire. Charles was 45 years old. Lavinia wasn't with him. Charles' stature was the only small thing about him. Everything else, larger than life. He lived the life of 100 men. He'd achieved enormous fame, fortune, and success. This included a huge wedding. Its funeral was no different, and saw over 20,000 attendees. Phineas even commissioned a life-size statue to stand forever at his dear friend's grave zone. Charles left behind a mourning wife who was about to get another unpleasant surprise. Lavinia planned to retire, but realized she couldn't. Turns out she couldn't afford to. While Charles and Lavinia earned mountains of money, they spent too much, especially Charles. Sadly, Lavinia resorted to selling many of her most prized belongings, including her wedding gifts and jewelry. The widow continued to work, and that's where she crossed paths with her next lover. 2 years after Charles' passing, Lavinia married again. This time it was to Count Primo Magri, an Italian and fellow little person. Count wasn't just a stage name. Primo Clamby was actually a count. Unfortunately, this title didn't come with any wealth, and so the newlyweds had to work at their famous roadside show. On paper, it appears as though Lavinia had moved on, but as it turns out, she never got over Charles. On November 25, 1919, Lavinia passed at 78. She outlived Charles by 33 years. Her second husband outlived her by a year, which makes her burial situation even more interesting. You see, Lavinia is buried next to Charles, but all she got was a gravestone that reads, "His wife." Unfortunately, Charles continued to be a magnet for criminals even well after his passing. In 1959, some hooligans sensibly destroyed the statue by his grave. Fortunately, the local community eventually restored the statue and grave to their former glory. And decades later, his legacy is certainly still more than that. Countless films and actors portrayed and immortalized Charles on film. Most notably, he was a character in the 2017 musical film The Greatest Showman. The film ended up a massive production that raked in $415 million alongside its star-studded cast. And most importantly, Sam Humphrey, an actor with skeletal dysplasia, played Charles, history's most famous little person with a legacy that looms larger than life. Despite the challenges he faced, being thrust into the spotlight as a child, living under constant scrutiny, and navigating the highs and lows of an extraordinary career, Charles left an indelible mark on history. He transformed public perceptions of little people, proving that talent, wit, and charisma could outshine even the harshest prejudices. His life, though tragically cut short, remains a poignant reminder of both the allure and cost of the limelight. Today we remember General Tom Thumb, not just as a performer, but as a man whose ambition and spirit allowed him to rise above adversity. His story continues to inspire, reminding us that no matter how small we may feel in the world, our impact can be anything but. If you enjoyed this Fact Nave video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.